Hello, Andrew Kercher here with Thumb Coast TV. Today, we'll be talking a little bit of Art Nouveau. We're going to go into the ancient past, and I'll be telling you about one of, I think, our area's greatest hidden gems. It's a little off the beaten path. We've got our explorer's hat on, so I hope you'll join me in heading around the block. So today, it's an absolutely beautiful day outside, a great day for a walk, nice and sunny. Behind me, Blue Water Hospice Home, they have a beautiful little walk. It's a great place for a little contemplative walk, to walk around the pond there behind me that's absolutely sparkling. But one of the cool things that people have maybe caught a glimpse of from the road is right behind me. Now, before we dive into our very first stop here, our first building I want to look at, I do, of course, want to thank our sponsors over at Adair Supply. So for all your historic restoration and preservation needs, check them out in Adair. Great little stop to pick up anything you need for that kind of restoration work. So you see behind me, and I'm going to turn around so we get a really good look, there is this beautiful little dome. You can see this from M29 as you're heading south from Marysville and St. Clair. You might catch a glimpse of this. There's a brilliant green that really stands out against that blue background. It's kind of an Art Nouveau. This is the Tom Locke Memorial Observatory. Of course, Hospice Home, they're doing really difficult work there. I'm sure everyone has lost a loved one at one time or another, and we know just how difficult they can be. They're really helping with a lot of that, and they offer, this is a place where you can kind of come with your family. You can check that out. Looks like they've got some fans on inside, so it could probably get pretty warm with all that glass, but I'm sure it's climate controlled, nice and comfortable. And with all that glass, great place to watch the evening or the nighttime stars. And all the things that come out in the evening, but some really, really cool Art Nouveau style decorations on this. So Art Nouveau is really popular right around the beginning of the 20th century, popular in Europe, spreads here. I've heard a really good description once. Sometimes people talk about Art Nouveau and Art Deco. They're really two different things. Art Nouveau, a great way I've heard it described is Art Nouveau is something you would see the elves make from Lord of the Rings, and Art Deco is something you would see the dwarves make. So if you're into Lord of the Rings, that's an easy way to remember that. But I thought that was an interesting place to start. That little dome there, that really cool observatory. But I want to shift gears completely, because there are a series of buildings that I have been mildly obsessed with like my entire life. My late father used to work not too far from where we are right now when I was growing up, and so visiting him at work was not all that uncommon an experience. And there were a series of these buildings, and if you know where I am, I'm going to flip this around so you can see. As we come around the corner here from Edison and Davis, the entrance to the Blue Water Hospice Home here back that way, we really get a sense of these really peculiar buildings. And we can see there are these kind of earthen mounds that build up to these really flat bottomed or flat topped slope side no window buildings. Like, it is such a throwback, and they're all kind of connected into like a greater complex. These earthen barriers are kind of like a ravelin, is what we would call that in the military world anyway. These ravelins are something that you see in like siege works in the 18th century. You build up a little earthen flat like that to hide behind it from cannon rounds. But the earthworks really blend right into the buildings, which I would describe as almost like a mastaba. Mastabas are, again, some of the oldest buildings that are still around. These mastabas go back all the way to the ancient world. They dot areas like ancient Sumer, Babylon, Egypt. Some of these are showing up as early as like the 3200s BC. So we're talking, 5,000 years ago. And they were great big mortuary complexes back then, with the burying somebody important, maybe a pharaoh, maybe a vizier, high priest, something like that on the inside. They're almost like a slab of something the Egyptians would become much more famous for a little bit later in history. We can see there are a couple of entrances on in. So these were built before I was born. They really date back to, I believe, the 1980s, and such a, again, interesting and peculiar design. I haven't, in all of my research, gotten a really good reason that they've done this, but there must have been one, right? So there are a number of times where Egyptian-style architecture comes back into vogue, and these are revivals, right? When this happens, we're going to stick over here off the road just a little bit. It's kind of a busy road, but I want to look at the other parts of this complex. It makes me think of one of the ancient Egyptian mortuary complexes, because back in ancient Egypt, it's around for such a long time that's incomprehensible, I think, to most of us. You know, when we think about ancient Egypt, it all tends to blur together, but it's something that existed for literally thousands of years. So you think about somebody like King Tut, right? Pretty famous Egyptian. Yeah, he's born 1,200 years after the pyramids are built. And like 2,000 years after some of these early mastabas are built that look a lot like this. They have these flat top. It comes from an Arabic word, mastaba, meaning table, because they'd be flat up on the top. So these are things that you could even build an entire complex. And one of these temple complexes would allow you to go venerate these ancestors, go and visit them. They held religious services there. Kind of marshy land out here out front, and the opposite of ancient Egypt. But it's really interesting the way that these blend in with this surrounding earthworks around the outside. Now, it was not too big of a leap to go from one of these mastabas into building something like a pyramid. In fact, the first pyramid, all you have to do is take 3 or 4 of these mastabas and put them right on top of each other. So you can see how this looks like the bottom layer of a pyramid if you stack that up. We're walking right by the welcome to Marysville. Look at this. The sun always shines in Marysville. Maybe true, right? 100 years old. I don't know if maybe that's literally true, but certainly an interesting thought. So there were people like Pharaoh Djoser, who was building, this is, we're talking 2700, 2800 BC. So we're talking a long time ago, 3000 BC, so that is 5,000 years ago, that Djoser would build his stepped pyramid. And you can see just how long this building is, that it continues with that same kind of simple geometric pattern. So when Djoser built his stepped pyramid, it was not too much after that they started filling in the sides. So if you think about a number of these smaller mastabas on top of each other, like a layer cake, it didn't take too much more effort, although it is a pretty amazing feat of engineering, for these ancient Egyptians to fill in the sides. And so you get eventually people like Snefru, who was building a couple of pyramids for himself, and then Khafre and some of the others who had built the Great Pyramids at Giza. Those are the ones we all think of when we think of the Great Pyramids and that era of the ancient world. In fact, the Great Pyramids were, for thousands of years, the tallest man-made buildings anywhere on Earth. It wasn't until the 19th century that they finally built something taller than the stacked up pile of rocks. And people were always fascinated by these pyramids, even in the ancient world, because they were around for so long that, again, when we say the ancient world, one of my favorite little statistics or perspective shifting thoughts, I guess is what it would be, is that we live closer to the time of Cleopatra than Cleopatra did to the time of the building of the pyramids. So they were old even in the ancient world. And people were always interested in how they were built. A lot has been said about that. Everyone's probably seen at least one, late night History Channel documentary suggesting it was aliens. I don't think that's the case, but there were a number of different construction methods and techniques proposed. I'm partial to the interior ramp theory, that rather than a big external ramp, they left corners knocked off, and so it's a great big spiral all the way to the top. And it's amazing what you can do with thousands of people and even just manpower. You can do some pretty amazing work with a few simple machines, some mechanical advantage, and a little bit of engineering knowledge. But we've come up here to the corner. I'm going to turn things around for the big reveal. I think if you've been down here, you know what is coming right around this corner. We saw all of those mastabas, so it makes sense that we would also have the Great Pyramid of Marysville. What an interesting building, right? So there's offices inside. It's currently for lease. We can see there's kind of a back entrance here. We're gonna hop over this little canal. So we got a back entrance that way with some of the HVAC systems. But for the rest of this building, you can really see, there we get it in all its glory with no trees in the way, a huge pyramid right here in the middle of the city. Certainly a way to stand out. And there have been, over the years, a number of these revival eras when Egypt has become kind of in the spotlight and popular. For example, the 1830s, there was a number of finds and archaeologists who began exploring some of these pyramids in a scientific way. It's when they had finally finished working with things like the Rosetta Stone to translate hieroglyphics. You can really see the sun glint off that metal of that pyramid. And when they were finally able to translate hieroglyphics, hieroglyphics had been forgotten for essentially thousands of years. Once they translated them, there was a mild obsession, and so Egyptian revival became in vogue. People were copying that. Every once in a while you can see like a really cool mausoleum in a cemetery. They would use, Egyptian styling, or maybe even a little pyramid or a sphinx. It became pretty popular. Just having a moment, so to speak. Another one of those moments would come in the 1920s. There is an Egyptian revival movement after Howard Carter in 1922 would find the tomb of Tutankhamun, who was an otherwise pretty unremarkable pharaoh. He wasn't pharaoh very long. He was coming in the New Kingdom, so we're talking again 1,200 years or so after the building of the original Great Pyramids. And look at this. How many pyramids have their own mailbox, right? We're here on Pyramid Drive for this great big pyramid. Pretty cool. And this will loop around back to where we kind of started. But I want to talk about two other buildings that are kind of back this way. So we're going to keep walking. I got a couple more things to say about a pyramid. So when they find Tutankhamun, they find him in the Valley of the Kings. Long after, the only problem with the pyramid, it's very impressive looking, and everybody knows about it. But if you're trying to keep what's inside safe, all of the burial goods, they were all looted and stolen from back in antiquity. So they're mostly empty, right? We can get a lot from the little bit of material cultures left behind. They found grave robber tunnels, things like that. But something like a pyramid like this is a very tempting target for grave robbers. So by the Middle Kingdom, they had really shifted away from building anything quite as ostentatious. They would still fill tombs of pharaohs with all sorts of grave goods, gold, anything, you name it. But all of that would wind up being stuck into some of these tombs that would carve way out into the desert. They would carve them into walls and into the ground, so there was no real thing to stand out. It was a little bit easier to try and secure those. Even that, over the course of thousands of years, didn't always work. There's some sense of irony in that a lot of the earliest grave robbers were some of the people who helped build the tombs. Can you imagine working on a pyramid for maybe 15 or 20 years, and then since you built it, like the week after the pharaoh is stuck in there, you're going to go back and rob the place blind? pretty wild to think about, like, your life's work in that way, but that amount of treasure that goes inside, pretty tempting. So the Valley of the Kings outside of Luxor was one of these later burial areas. And we're talking, so when you talk about Egyptian history, they talk a lot about dynasties, right? The mastabas are built by like pre-dynastic Egypt and the first and second dynasties. And so those are whole families of rulers. Later on, it's the fourth dynasty and the early fifth dynasty that are building the big pyramids we know of. By the time we get to King Tut, we're talking about the 18th dynasty. That is incomprehensibly a long time for one civilization to be putting out all of this work. So Howard Carter was lucky enough to find one of these tombs that had not been cracked open. It was covered in rubble. There had been actually a couple of flash floods in the Valley of the Kings, and that meant that all of those wonders were preserved, making King Tut, although maybe not the most famous ruler in his time, certainly the most famous Egyptian that you're going to find alive today. So that's my screed on Egypt and Egyptology. Now, the other thing I want to talk about while we're down here is another really cool aspect, kind of Marysville and Blue Water history. There's a great big factory complex here. We're walking down Wills Street, and that'll come into play at the very end of things here. But I think this is a great place for a quick word from our sponsor. We're going to head up to this factory here on the right. But hear a little bit more from Adair Supply, who makes all of these videos possible, and I'll catch up with you once we're a little bit closer.
At Adair Supply, we're proud to serve our hometown with quality lumber, reclaimed treasures, and service you can count on. Whether you're building new or restoring old, you'll find what you need right here. Adair Supply, your small town source for new and reclaimed materials, open all winter on St. Clair Highway.
All right, we're back again. Big thanks to Adair Supply. Now, we're a little bit closer to this factory complex. Again, we're here on Wills Street in Marysville, and this is a pretty big complex. I'm going to turn things around here. And this was originally built by the defense industry. So there was actually a corporation set up during World War II to pop up defense factories all around the country. And this is one of the early ones that was set up in cooperation with Dow Chemical. This was originally a magnesium plant, and we're just about to step over the railroad tracks that tie this in to the rest of the country. And magnesium is something that most of us probably don't think about on a daily basis, but magnesium was kind of this miracle metal at the beginning of the 20th century. There's a lot of interesting properties that it has. In World War I, they were using a lot of magnesium in rockets. So they'd shoot up flares during the First World War, light up an area for like an attack at night or something like that. Now, by World War II, they realized there was actually a big call for magnesium, not only for building things like rockets, but even for adding in to make very lightweight metal. So you add that with things like aluminum. People have probably heard of like a magnesium engine block. The Germans liked doing that as well. You could get a lot of power out of something that didn't weigh a whole lot, certainly a lot lighter than something like cast iron. So there was a huge call for it. So by 1942, they started building this factory here. It was opened in 1943. Amazingly, by the end of the war, they had even closed this before the war ended, because the United States government said, oh, well, you know, we kind of overplanned. We actually have more magnesium than we need, and they redistributed things. So the complex here, built using all these taxpayer dollars, it seemed like a shame to tear it down. So after the war, it changed hands a couple of times. They would produce a little bit more magnesium. There were some of these interesting thoughts. You can even go back to the Times Herald and read about 1945. They figured everyone would have a personal helicopter rather than a personal car, and they would need magnesium for that. In 1953, there was a company founded in Port Huron called American Tape. And this is the company my late father would work for. American Tape was founded to make basically masking tape for the automotive industry. We know how many cars are being built in and around Detroit. Port Huron, of course, and Marysville, home to a lot of Chrysler plants up here specifically. Marysville, a long tie to the automotive industry, which we'll kind of conclude with. But the buildings here, they would move in 1963. American Tape would move down here. And I know you're probably wondering, we see all these signs that say IPG. It's not American Tape. Today, it's Intertape Polymer Group. So this was actually like a Canadian concern. They bought up a number of tape factories all around the country, and they make some other industrial products. They're big competitors with like 3M, making sometimes a lot of the same type of material. And there's a lot of interesting pieces to the architecture at a plant like this. You know, there's all these disconnected buildings, there's condensers, there's pipes, you know, it's very clear all of this is industrial. I do like they have kind of one admin building that's very small over here that looks like a little cube with windows. Know that my father worked in IT, and that's where his office and all of the computer work was. But lots of shipping and receiving gates, that sort of thing, as they are still major tape manufacturers. Now, the other interesting thing about this factory, when this was operating originally back in the 1940s, for some of the chemical processes that they needed a huge amount of copper. And copper and brass were incredibly valuable during the war. Well, one thing they found, and this is almost too hard to believe, they found in several instances where you can use industrial copper, silver has a lot of the same properties. Now, no sane person would ever run silver wire through their house. It's just way too valuable, right? But in this particular instance, when copper was far more valuable to be turned into like brass alloys and shells and things like that, the United States government did have industrial quantities of silver, and they could use that during the war. They would actually send out guards from the Treasury Department to keep an eye on millions of dollars worth of silver, not being used for jewelry, but being used for its industrial purposes. So again, you can see these kind of huge buildings take up a lot of space for all of the work that goes in to making all of that, you know, masking tape and things like that. So all numbered, and quite a few buildings. We'll actually walk back this way. We'll take a look at the other side here, and a variety of era of buildings, but a lot of this heavy industry. A lot of these buildings were designed after architects like Albert Kahn. He did a lot of automotive buildings, which are far bigger than what we even see here. There are a few of these buildings that look like a little bit older in style, like up here on the corner. Has kind of some really thick block windows, heavy masonry, but a lot of these are just fabricated metal buildings because you need an incredible volume of space inside to put whatever kind of machinery you need, like big rollers or winders, and then of course all of the things like forklifts that'll move inside to pick up this industrial amounts of tape to be sent out. It's kind of hard to imagine all of the connections that are needed in an automotive industry, but you do need a lot of masking tape in the entire manufacture process, and consumers can buy this as well. So next time you buy a roll of tape, take a look, see if you see any of that American Tape or Intertape Polymer Group label when you're picking up that tape. So one of the last things I wanted to talk about, while we're back here in this kind of weird little industrial park, mentioned we were on Will Street, and that's what we're walking back to. Marysville has this long automotive history. It really wouldn't be here without the automotive world. Marysville was actually called Vicksburg back in the 19th century, and really only changed that name Marysville in the 20th century, largely because of the work of C. Harold Wills. So he's a name, if you're from Marysville, you've almost certainly heard that name. C. Harold Wills was an automotive engineer who got his start with the Ford Motor Company. Here we can see another one of these kind of classic industrial building designs across the street. But I like this little guy down here on the corner because this is actually the Will St. Clair Museum. You know, they're volunteer run, so sadly they don't have a ton of hours. They're open on Sundays, a few more times in the summer than they are in the winter. But if you haven't been, you have to come check them out. This is the largest collection of Will St. Clair, not only automobiles, but memorabilia. Will St. Clair, as I mentioned, started at Ford Motor. In fact, he's even responsible for that blue oval, and that Ford signature is in his handwriting. So one of the other things real quick while we're right here, we can also see, you know, we talked about Intertape, one of those other names that everybody knows, Mueller Brass. They own a number of these buildings in this industrial park as well. It's an old Port Huron Company. We'll have to talk about Mueller Brass and tell their story sometime and look at the Port Huron division, but this is the Marysville Mueller Brass. So again, right across the street from this Will St. Clair Auto Museum. So Will's, his big contribution, not only was he kind of a designer, he was a metallurgist. So he is the one who's adding like molybdenum to the steel in Model Ts. He becomes a multi-millionaire with all of that Ford stock. And when he is kind of tires of making cheap cars, he was a bit of a perfectionist. He decided, I want to make a very, very nice car. And so that's what he would do. And he would actually build Marysville as a town to do that in. And so Marysville was really a planned community. I really recommend, again, checking out that auto museum here. You can see the beautiful Canadian Goose logo that they had on the Will St. Clair. Although they made tens of thousands of Will St. Clairs, there's probably less than 100 left in the world today, and you can see over a dozen of them there at the Will St. Clair Museum. So definitely worth your support. If you like history, you're watching this, I bet you probably do. So Will's were only manufacturing cars from 1921 until like 1927. They were not a particularly long-lived car. They really could never reach the production numbers they needed to stay in business. But kind of a fitting tribute to them here in the core of Marysville's industrial area. So how about that for a block? Maybe not exactly a residential block, but certainly some of the most unique pieces of architecture you're going to find anywhere in the Blue Water area here in Marysville, just off of M29. So next time you're down, you got an extra couple minutes, you can kind of drive the little loop back here. Take a look at some of the really cool things that are here off the beaten path. So until next time, keep exploring here in your own backyard all of the really cool things we have, and I'll hope you join me next time as we continue to go around the block.